Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the top political stories of the day. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we're joined by Michael McDonald, who's a professor of political science at the University of Florida. Michael is an expert on voter turnout and redistricting, and he leads UF's election lab, which analyzes survey and election data to better inform people about how our electoral system works. Michael's scholarship has been widely published, and he's frequently interviewed about elections by the media. With state legislative elections coming up quickly in 4 states this November, we figured now would be the perfect time to have him on the show. So Michael, thanks for coming on the show.
Great to be with you.
So we have a lot of academics on the show, and we kind of like to start with asking them a little bit about their origin story. How did you end up studying politics and elections more specifically?
I had a radioactive spider bite me and gave me my election superpowers.
We've never heard that before.
Yeah. I've always had an interest in this. I grew up in the rural South and saw a lot of the negative things that were happening around race relations in the South. And so at a very early age, I was introduced to political discussion within my home and within my community. And so I was a bit of an activist when it came to my community on various things like this is the mid 80s, we held our first integrated prom in our public high school. Before that, there were 2 proms for white people and black people. And, and so trying to go overcome some of those, race issues really made me politically aware at an early point in my life. But I really wanted to be a scientist. I mean, I really wanted to go out, and I went to Caltech as an undergraduate. At the time, it was the #1 school in the world, and it was the engineering school. And I wanted to study astronomy and physics, and that was really what I really wanted to do. And as time went on, I just started falling into doing computer science, and I fell in with some professors in the social sciences department there who were doing statistical analyses for published research and on human behavior issues. And that really interested me. And it was marrying together interests that I had in computer science with actually studying human behavior. And so it was that process that sort of opened the door. And then as I graduated from Caltech, I went to work for a political consulting firm that handles the elections and reapportionment database for the state of California. And one of the jobs that I worked on early on was providing analyses for a voting rights case against the Los Angeles City's supervisors, or really the county supervisors. And it was kind of fun. I mean, I'm doing work with the Department of Justice just out of undergraduate school, and doing these voting analyses. And I was doing the analyses, and then there were some professors that I knew that were presenting my work in the courtroom. And, I was like, wait a second, I'd rather be that guy. And so at that point, I decided I was going to go off to graduate school and write a dissertation on redistricting, which is what I did. And again, just sort of things evolved. And I was asked by one of my professors to analyze some data on voting for the exit poll organization. And I did that. And I started realizing, there's all this interesting things going on with voting. And importantly, from my career perspective, it was that the turnout rate was actually not going down in the United States, which was widely in the mid-1990s. That's what people thought. Instead, what was happening was the ineligible population was increasing. So it was non-citizens primarily, but also ineligible felons. And so as that population was increasing, they were not being accounted for in turnout rates. And so the decline in turnout, if you look back in the 1990s, you'll find books written on this to explain what's going on. Why are turnout rates going down? You'll find op-eds, pundits talking about this incessantly. And it turned out it was just a real artifact of the data. And again, it goes back to my interest of data and doing sort of computer science work, blending that in with elections, all that sort of, is a nexus for me. And it's really what I think marks my career as an academic is that, I sometimes refer to myself jokingly as the janitor of political science, because I just do this grunt work of getting things cleaned up, making sure that people have information and data. And, another colleague once said, you're the most widely used but least cited professor in academia. And he's probably right, because the turnout rate data I do and other sort of work during an election season, the early voter tracker, for instance, that I produce, is getting over 1 million unique hits across the world. And I see people reposting my data and claiming it as their own. And all I ask for you is just to acknowledge that, I produced it. I don't charge you any money for that, but it's just turnout rates, same sort of stuff. You look at it, it's getting used widely, and then people just start regurgitating the same numbers, and it loses that I was the origin of it. And
that's something that we see too with Ballotpedia. Ballotpedia's research gets cited all the time by the media, and Ballotpedia just get mentioned. It's just people, they appreciate the facts and then forget who came up with them, or aggregated them all, I guess.
And in this space, look, if you're going to produce a public good like this, you just have to recognize that this is what is going to happen. And I see people all the time complain, they didn't cite me. And I'm like, yeah, well, welcome to the club. But the reason why they're not citing you is because they think it's valuable. And so at least take that solace in what you're doing. People think it's valuable.
Let's jump into the UF Election Lab, which is fairly new. It developed out of the United States Elections Project, which you started earlier in your career. How did the United States Elections Project evolve into the Elections Lab?
Well, it actually goes very much back to the reasons I was just discussing about attribution and branding. And, in the media age, you just have to be very much cognizant and aware that you have to manage your persona out there in the world. And if you don't, you may miss out on opportunities. I know that some people get into this space and they're always, disruptors. They're there, they're the new voice there, and funders will say, okay, let's support the disruptor. And I'm saying, like, here I am, I'm over here, I'm already doing this. Maybe I know something, but again, attention and money tend to flow to these disruptors. It's just, again, part of the whole nature of the beast. It sounds like you're about to say, yeah, and that's a Ballotpedia too.
Some of that for sure, yeah. I also jumped ahead. We should inform our listeners who are less familiar with the Elections Lab what you all do. What's your mission?
Yeah, well, I'm getting there. So I was discussing earlier about the voter turnout data and how, I had put a website together, this Elect Project website that was disseminating that updated information from research papers that I had published in the past, and just trying to keep everything updated. And so each new election, you really can't, again, this is why I call myself a janitor of political science. You can't really publish a new academic paper every time there's a new election and expect that to get published. And so I just put the website together so that people could have it in case they want to do some research on it, maybe have their own question. Maybe it's going to be used for, public policy reasons. I know the Minnesota Secretary of State's office uses it as their official turnout rate. They love it because Minnesota is usually number one in turnout rates. So they like it, but, and other people are using it as well. And so I just keep it going, even though for me, professionally, it doesn't get me a lot of academic credit, at least how the metrics that academics use to measure, how many publications do you have and that sort of stuff. That's what people really care about. So one thing was going on is moving all of that onto a platform. But another really important product that we produce is precinct boundaries and the associated election results at the statewide level. That was used and is currently being used in many, many situations across the country. So places like Virginia, Ohio, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, among others, they actually officially use these data as part of their redistricting process. So they were taking data that we were producing, making publicly available to everybody. Some state governments actually adopted it. Apps like, Dave's redistricting app use it. And I don't even know, and neither does Dave, who I talk with, know the extent of all the local governments that were using this and other purposes that people were using our data for. So it got well out there. We have our own app called District Builder that we can look at our usage and track it a little bit better. And we can still see lots of localities are using the District Builder and tens of thousands of users creating accounts. So we know that it was getting used very widely in that sphere. And then in litigation, the recent Alabama court decision that the Supreme Court finding a racial gerrymander of the congressional districts there, they were using our data. And it took us 2.5 years to pull that data together. It was not an easy thing to get the data out of Alabama, especially when you're talking to those probate judges who run elections in Alabama and trying to get that data. It's really hard. And so, again, we had all this data, but it's sitting off on an archive that's at Harvard Dataverse. And people literally, I talked with editors like at the Washington Post who use our data, and they thought that Harvard produced our data because it's sitting in an archive that Harvard has. And so the real reason why I created this election lab at the University of Florida was that we needed to better brand what we were doing so that media organizations like the Washington Post, among others, and lots of others. Talked to lots of media folks who use our data as well, but also, more importantly, funders, so that they can recognize that this is not being produced by Harvard, and it's actually being produced here at the University of Florida.
Yeah, it's amazing to think of all of the number of people that do use that data from, like you were saying, apart from the media, you have political scientists, local governments, like lots of people. You all use voting eligible populations to calculate turnouts. So for like the average listener, what does that mean and how does that differ from other voter turnout calculations?
Yeah, I referenced it earlier. Again, it before in the 1990s or so, and before that, people were calculating turnout rates as the number of voters divided by the voting age population, everyone age 18 and older within the United States or a state or locality or whatever. And then I started noticing, doing this work for the exit poll organization, that the non-citizen population had been growing quite a bit. And when you took that into account, just it alone completely changed the narrative or the perception that turnout rates were going down in the country, because they were going down, but what was really happening was you were including this ineligible population, non-citizens, which had been growing. It went from about 2% in 1970 to about 10% in 2000, around 2000. Yeah, that'd be about right. And so, and then on top of that, you had ineligible felons, which were about 0.5% in 1970, and were about 1.5% by 2000. So you had a big change here in ineligible populations. And so taking that into account, this downward decline was entirely explained by just a measurement issue. And so I thought it was important to get that out there. And it's it was a very easy, simple explanation. And sometimes the easiest, most simple explanations are the ones that turn out to be right. And I had lots of people come after me. I destroyed a whole research agenda in political science where there were professors at top Ivy League schools who dedicated their careers to trying to explain what I pointed out was just a very simple measurement issue. And they all looked at it and they came after me, which is kind of, here I am, just a lowly assistant professor, and you've got Ivy League full professors coming after you. It's quite
scary.
And interesting. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's an interesting situation to be in. But at the end of the day, no one could put a dent in the research, and now it's just widely reported. Again, I keep going on, but like textbooks use it, the media use it, states have adopted it. So it gets. In the end of the day, I turned out to be right. But again, there was a moment there, early on in my career where I'm in the wilderness and having people attack me. It was not fun.
Sure. An aspect of elections you also personally have a focus on is early voting. So why do you feel it's important to track that data specifically? And can it help make a reliable turnout prediction or suggest results at all?
Yeah. So again, the evolution of this particular project goes back to the exit poll organization. They needed to track early voting activity starting back in 2000 or even earlier, because states like Oregon in 2000 had gone to all mail ballot elections. And so they could no longer actually run an exit poll in Oregon. They needed to run a telephone poll of people who had already voted. And other states weren't where Oregon was yet, but they still had substantial populations of people voting by mail or voting in person early prior to Election Day. And so the exit poll organization had recognized this and said, well, we're going to have to do supplemental surveys, phone surveys of these people so that we can, just in case, and it turns out this is true, that if early voters are different than election day voters, we got to know how they're behaving so that we're better able to describe what the electorate is looking like. Now, let me be very clear about this because hopefully your audience is pretty savvy, but it's a misperception that the exit poll organization calls the elections based on exit polls. They don't do it on the polls. We do it. I've worked with them now since 2002 for various media entities. And when we do our calling of elections, it's only like in a Washington, D.C. or Utah where all the evidence says, yeah, we know the Republican's going to win Utah. So, we can call that. It's a pretty safe state. If it's at all going to be uncertain, if there's any uncertainty at all, we're going to look at the actual election results. But then again, we need to kind of know how many early voters are out there and manage that flow of information on election night. It's a really big data problem to make everything work well. And so early in the 2000s, the exit poll organization asked me to track some of the early voting activity. And so this was the 2008 election where I said, you know what, I'm collecting this information. I've got a website. I'll just post it on the website. Couldn't harm it. Maybe people will give me clues and tips as to where I should be looking for data. And then like a million hits later, because that was never my plan, but it just got out there. And again, you talk about I said earlier, I don't do a very good job of branding and people taking your information. I would look at the media started putting their own early voting trackers out there and they were using my data. And I was like, well, they should at least acknowledge that the data is coming from me, not, just put some data up there. And so it just evolved that way. Now, of course, people started wanting to know, well, who's going to win? What does this early voting data tell us? That's the whole prurient interest of the public and the media when they're looking at these data. And so naturally I'm being asked this question. And so I start having to give a response. And I use an approach which is very common in academia. It's called difference in difference. Basically, you compare the current election with the activity you've got currently going on with a prior election. And if nothing's changed, that's kind of an important point, then you're able to see, relatively, are there the number of registered Democrats or registered voters, is it running different than it did prior? And if it's more in one way or another, we might guess that there's at least more enthusiasm among one side, partisan side, into voting early. And that might then say that that's going to carry on through election day. But again, everything has to be the same in order to make that claim. And so some of the art in this, because people say, well, why don't you just do a model and do everything else? It's like, well, it can work in some states, but in others, you have to use expert judgment because you know that there's been some fundamental change to the way in which elections are being run. And if you make this leap of faith that nothing's changed, you're going to end up making some bad predictions. Or maybe voting behavior changes. What really happened in the 2020 election, we had about 40% of the electorate vote early in 2016. That was 75% in the 2020 election. So just a tremendous increase. And of course, the pandemic was driving that. Yeah, but it wasn't just that it was more mail balloting. Suddenly, something that Republicans used to do quite a bit, which was mail balloting, you have all these Democrats doing it. And you have Donald Trump saying mail balloting's bad, it's fraudulent. And so Republicans are listening to that and they go, oh, well, either they're going to vote on election day or they're going to vote in person early. And so in person early prior to 2020, that was typically won by the Democrats. And suddenly we see these patterns completely flip in 2020. And, I think you could make some pretty solid projections by looking at some of the all-mail ballot states in 2020 as to what was going to happen on election night. But there was a lot more uncertainty of what was going on with the 2020 election because it wasn't just the rules and policies that changed, it's that the behavior changed itself. And we're seeing some of that persist now, but at the same time, we're seeing some reversion back to the prior patterns we saw before 2020, say in the 2022 election. So, we're sort of at a halfway point. It'll be really interesting to see what's going to happen in 2024. Trump is actually now cutting advertisements for the Republican National Committee to encourage people to vote early. And they're trying to road test this in the Virginia state elections. And so, clearly the Republicans realized, and even at the time in 2020, that Trump's rhetoric was not helping them win elections. And it looks like someone convinced Trump that, which is hard to do. I give him a lot of credit. They managed to get through to Trump and say, hey, maybe this is hurting us and maybe you should do something different. And he actually listened. So it'll be really fascinating from my perspective to see how does that affect everything as we go into, these upcoming elections at the state level, but really those 2024 elections. This
is kind of more like almost a fun question, but considering you track voter turnout, do you track factors that play into voter turnout? So I write about ballot measures. So do you ever kind of track how ballot measures being on the ballot factor into voter turnout, or even like the weather factoring into voter turnout on election day?
Yeah, I teach a class on election data science, and I have students who do projects along these lines, and then some of those get actually turned into publishable research. And so, yeah, we look at it. We looked at the effect of Hurricane Matthew on turnout, for example, in one student's project that was published. So, hey, he was an undergraduate too. We had some really bright undergraduates at the University of Florida. So it's kudos to him. And so in any case, yeah, we could see some effects, but we could also see shifting mode effects too, which is not surprising. Vote mode effects, meaning the way in which people are voting. And not surprisingly, there were some of those effects going on, more in-person early voting, more mail balloting as a response to the unavailability of polling places on election day. And I've got another student doing something similar with Hurricane Ian and their effect in Southwest Florida. Unfortunately, we get hurricanes in Florida.
Yeah. I went to college in Florida.
We get to study these things. Ballot initiatives, I don't really study that much, but my colleague Dan Smith does study that. And he's found a small effect on turnout. But, they were looking across a large number of elections, different types of ballot initiatives. And I would say when you look at some of these abortion constitutional amendments and things of that nature on the ballots, those are a different creature. And it's a different level of salience to the voters. And clearly we can see just, when you see a primary election in Kansas have presidential general election turnout levels when there's a constitutional amendment about abortion on the ballot, there's an effect there. People clearly care about the issue. And when people care about something, they're much more likely to vote.
Now, let's turn to the elections on the horizon. You all have a demonstration page about New Jersey's election for their state legislative elections this November. Can you tell us a little bit about what that data is telling you about the state legislative elections next month? And are you going to have those demonstrations for other states?
I would not draw any inferences at this point as what's going to happen in New Jersey, because these state legislative elections are a lot different than general elections in terms of who participates, among other things. They're going to have lower turnout. There's no statewide election really there to pull people out to vote. And New Jersey's really fundamentally changed the way in which they run their elections since the last time, 4 years ago, they just had these similar elections. So we're missing some of those key components that we need to make a solid prediction on what's going to happen in the election in New Jersey. And, similar, that goes with Virginia as well. You can't really look back in time to 2019 and make some firm projections there either, but there's even less data available. At least New Jersey has party registration, which is a pretty solid indicator of partisanship. It's what people register, not what they identify with, but still, and I've done research on that too, but it's a pretty good indicator and it's pretty stable. And so I would just say the reason why I put together the New Jersey demonstration page was just to start coding, thinking about my workflow when it comes to producing these statistics. And one of the nice things about this new website is I taught myself a little bit of JavaScript, and I've got some web developers I'm working with. And so I'm able to produce pages that will, if I just provided a data file onto the page, everything populates immediately, all the graphics and all the analyses. And that really helps my workflow in terms of producing the data. Because during the month and a half before an election, like in 2024, I'm going to be chained to my computer. And my wife, we jokingly refer to her as an election widow during that period of time, because that's all I'm doing every day, except on the weekends where the data flow peters out a bit, is I'm just processing data. And and a lot of people don't even realize in the back of the scene, it's just me. it's I don't have anybody else helping me with it. And sometimes I'll get like, the state of Wisconsin changed the format of their data file, and it's broken everything that I do. And I've now posted some bad statistics, and I've got to go back and fix all this. And so I'm frantically working for 2 or 3 hours on something I never anticipated to have to work with, trying to fix a problem that, some curveball that the election officials threw at me midway through the early voting period. I mean, this happened in North Carolina as well. They changed the way in which they were delivering their ballot request data in 2020, midway through. And then, and now I've got to do more coding and everything else. But basically, that's what this page is for, is just to start setting this up, start thinking of how I'm going to visualize the data. And I haven't really touched it in the last week and a half, but I really do intend to do a lot more with it in terms of the analyses and investigating if we can do some mapping on it and other things like that.
And then finally, you published a book last year called From Pandemic to Insurrection, and it took a deep dive into the election of 2020. Looking at that book and then also ahead to the 2024 election, what behaviors are you interested most in from voters, like to seeing what's going to last from the 2020 election into the 2024 election? Will mail-in voting be as high in 2024, do you think, or early voting surpass that?
Yeah. So just to say, like, why I wrote the book in the first place was early on in the pandemic, and it became clear that we were going to have lots of mail balloting. I got all these reporters calling me and asking me, explain to me how mail balloting works. And so I would have to have like an hour to 2 hour conversation with the reporter to get them up to speed on how mail balloting works. Every 10 years, I get this too with redistricting. Explain to me how redistricting works. I'm like, all right, well, here you go. And I have to explain it all. So I started writing up a little explainer so I could just say, here, read this first, and then I can answer any questions that you have. And as I was doing that, I kept writing, and I kept writing this explainer. And eventually I was like, this is like a whole chapter. I mean, this is like a 40-page document here that's explaining how the whole process works and the history of early voting and mail balloting. And so I said, well, I guess I've started writing a book. So as the election progressed, and I was very much interested in all this of like what's all the legal maneuvering around early voting, because in some states, they didn't have mail balloting. They in the same way they had excuse required absentee voting, and their legal system, their constitutions and their state statutes were designed for that sort of election to be run, and they did not fit well with what the emergency policies that were trying to be put in place to encourage people to vote by mail. And so there was a lot of legal battles here during this period of time, and I was tracking all that and making notes about it. And tracking along who was, even during the primary season, like what's going on. Maryland, they adopt all mail ballot elections for the primary, but they don't do it for the general election. And some of the, the reasons that are being said by the state governments. And so, I was just compiling all this information. And so it just sort of stretched out, like these were additional chapters to write for a book. And then, of course, we get an overtime, which I don't think me or anybody else really wanted. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but it's the election administrator's prayer that you don't have a close election. Please, Lord, don't let the election be close, because then all the warts are exposed in the whole thing. And so we end up having a close election, and we go into the overtime and the claims of what's happening. And I actually worked in some of the litigation during that period of time. And at one point, I had my bags packed. I was going to drive up to Atlanta and testify on behalf of the state of Georgia in one of Trump's election lawsuits. But then right at the, I'm calling up the lawyers. Should I get in my car? Should I drive up to Atlanta? And it was that afternoon. They said, no, they just can't dismiss their lawsuit. So they retracted it. So I didn't have to drive up to Atlanta to testify. So it was kind of an interesting experience from that perspective, that I was engaged in all that sort of thing. So I was, again, very much tracking along everything that was happening with the legal wrangling that was happening during this period of time. And so I just continued writing the book to add the chapter in what happens in the aftermath of the election. So now I didn't answer your question. So let me answer your question now, which is what do I think is going to happen in 2024? Well, again, we're already seeing some of these patterns upended in the 2020 election. They are persisting to a certain degree, but there's been a lot of reversion back to, say, 2016 patterns that we could see in the 2022 data. So I still expect we're going to see early voting increase in usage. We had some states, for the temporary basis in 2020, adopt all mail ballot elections, places like Nevada, Vermont, DC. They did it on a permanent basis. California was going that way, and now they did it on an emergency basis for 2020. They're already all mail ballots. So you saw some states like put the emergency provisions into law. And although we're not going to see the same amount of usage across all the states across the country in mail balloting, I still think we've had greater usage of mail balloting. It's being offered more frequently across the country, and voters like it. So once they do it, they vote by mail in particular. They're much more likely to do this again. And it's why places like Oregon and Washington and Colorado, they had permanent absentee ballot lists. That was their transition into all mail ballot elections. So we're probably going to see something like that. At the same time, there's going to be a little retrenchment, because a state like Florida has made it more difficult for people to get a mail ballot. And that'll be really fascinating to see. Do we see a reversion back to Democrats voting in person early? But Republicans seem to like that too. So that'll be fascinating to see Florida, and what happens. So it won't be universal that we're going to see, I think, early voting usage going up everywhere. There could be some retrenchment. What do I think about the election itself? Look, Donald Trump, for better or worse, you either love him or you hate him, he drives conversations, and people will believe the election matters if Donald Trump is on the ballot. So, most likely he's going to be the Republican nominee. I think that would be a very low chance of him not being the nominee at this point, barring any health issue or something like that. And so, a rematch of Biden versus Trump, that was the highest turnout rate election since 1900, 120 years. And even in 2022, while the turnout rate was not as high as it was in 2018, it was still above the average we've had for the last 40 years. And so if Trump's at all in the mix in 2024, we're going to have another very high turnout rate election. And most likely it'll be a very close election, because we're very much divided nationally. And of course, it'll come down to some of those key battleground states. And some of them do have all mail ballot elections, like Colorado, and have very generous early voting, places like Arizona. And so guess what? We're going to be able to tell, I would say, before the election, if it's a blowout election one way or another, it's going to start showing up in the data. If it's not, that'll also show up in the data. And so I would say, get to like end of October, we should have a good sense of how this is all going to play out on election day.
Well, you better start praying your no close election prayer.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the election administrators, but yeah, I worked that a month and a half doing all that data work, and then you get, oh no, we got an election that's going to continue on for another month.
Yeah.
Not what I wanted. I wanted it to be over.
Yep. Wrap it up, put a bow on your data, and call it a day. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. So thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with us. This was a pretty fascinating conversation. And yeah, thank you for your time.
All right. Great to talk with you.
And for our listeners, before I let you go, we're in the middle of our Ballotpedia Society fall membership campaign. And we ask you to join other generous donors who've committed to making a monthly donation to Ballotpedia. By making a monthly gift, you'll help Ballotpedia provide daily, weekly, and monthly newsletters and podcasts just like this that are incisive, informative, and yes, free. There's no way we could keep Americans up to date with accurate information and reporting if it weren't for our Ballotpedia Society members. If you'd like to become one, please visit donate.ballotpedia.org/BPS drive to sign up. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.